You don't need to have it all together and figured out to get started. Just get started and start creating that momentum for yourself and then keep it going.
This is 1000 Routes. Every episode, a solopreneur shares how they're building, what they're building. We'll hear all about how they've made the bet on themselves, the uncommon route that they're taking to build a business that serves their life, and the reality of building a business of one. I'm your host, Nick Bennett. Before we get started, I'm excited to share a new program that I've been working on called Full Stack Solopreneur, in partnership with my friend and legendary entrepreneur, Erica Schneider. Now, unlike other programs, Full Stack Solopreneur is a hybrid digital program for independent professionals who are too far along for another course to be really all that helpful, but not far enough to invest in a private coaching or consulting service. In here, you'll gain access to both the full curriculum and monthly group coaching clinics to teach you how to create a legendary niche offer, how to build a content engine, and how to sell like a human. You can learn more at fullstacksolo.com. That's fullstacksolo.com.
My name is John Bonini. I'm the founder of a company called Content Brands. And Content Brands is a consulting program that helps B2B companies turn their expertise into a content engine that builds awareness, trust, and an audience that actually cares every time you publish.
All right, dude. This one is like the most anticipated interview for me because I think I've been asking you to book this for about 5 months. You and I went out on our own. We have one thing in common. I think we have like the same solo birthday. Or it's like we're off by like one day. I think June 26th was mine. I think you're the 25th.
Yeah, it's somewhere in there. Yeah, it's like mid to late June. So it was in there for sure.
Dude, you've been building some good content for a while and you've been dabbling. You were doing like the Patreon thing before it was, or when Patreon was like really the only game in town. There wasn't really a whole bunch of options to like build communities and monetize your life when you started. So you were building some good content, built up this massive LinkedIn following. How did you end up leaving Databox? Basically to decide, okay, this is going to be the thing.
Yeah.
I'm just going to do this now.
First, like the way some good content came about, which was like, a paid community on Patreon. I mean, a couple of things. One, it was COVID, needed something to do, but also this has been happening and like reading the tea leaves and people like other opportunities to make money and leverage your expertise. This has been a movement that's been happening for, I don't know, the better part of the last 5 or so years, and tools and technology have made it easier to be able to do that. And I think like the first time you make $1 on your own, and when I say on your own, I mean without an employer, the first time you make $1, it breaks everything and just changes everything, because I think you start to see different opportunities and possibilities. So I started doing that, 2 years before I left Databox, right? I started that group. And I think like it just came to a point where I think Databox and I outgrew each other. And what I mean by that is like, I got to a point where I wanted to go do this and I knew I could go do this full time. I wouldn't say knew, but I was probably just too afraid, honestly, to take the leap at the time. But then also Databox had gotten to a point where that head of marketing, when you first come into a company when they're small and they're not known yet, and you're establishing different programs and mediums, and you're establishing a podcast, a newsletter, the content program, you're making those first hires, that like groundbreaking and building up the team, we were out of that phase. And really kind of what they needed at that point from a marketing leader was an operator who could come in and scale, and not necessarily somebody who, obviously you always need creators, but maybe not at that degree. So I think we just kind of got to a point where we had both outgrown each other, and Pete and I, the CEO of Databox, had a really honest conversation at that time. I don't know that I would have gone solo then if it wasn't for him, honestly, because he made it seem like that was the obvious next move. He's like, well, this is obviously what you should go do. I'm paraphrasing. He's like, you're going to go do that, right? And I was like, well, probably not. Like, that's crazy. I had another kid come in at the time. And then it just, the more I talked to him about it, he's like, we'll be your first client. And, I'll help you like pressure test some stuff for you, get your first website up, pressure test your messaging, all this stuff. And I remember thinking, if I don't do this now, with this opportunity and somebody who's willing to be my first client, help me with messaging and give me his direct feedback, which for those of you who might know Pete Caputa, that's all he's capable of, is direct feedback. I was like, then I'm never going to do it. So don't lie to yourself, John. Don't say like, oh, now it's just not the right time. It'll be better. Because no, it won't. It won't be better than right now. You won't have another opportunity like right now. Just do it. And if you fail, just get another job in 6 months. That's kind of like the thought process of how it all came to be and like where I was, where Databox was. And it just came to like a point where it was like the perfect time for me to make that decision. And now looking back in retrospect, I'm just glad I made it. And I wasn't too chicken shit to be like, no, let me go get another job right now and I'll do this later. Not that I wouldn't have. I just would have hemmed and hawed a lot more. And it would have been harder if you weren't at this pivot point in your career and at the companies. But it was just the perfect time to do it. And I'm glad I was able to have the courage to do it at that time.
You said you were afraid of something. What were some of the things you were afraid of?
Everything, not having money, not being able to support my family. I've been fortunate enough, working in tech where my wife hasn't worked since we had our second. Those of you listening who are parents understand the daycare costs and how insane that is. So at that time, I was like, I had just gotten a big raise at the company I was at. This was before Databox. I was like, we're good. Like, stay home because that's what she wanted to do. I wouldn't have forced her to do that, but that's what she wanted to do. And so that was 2018. And so ever since then, I've been supporting the family financially. So yeah, that's the first thing you're thinking of, right? I'm not thinking about me or thinking about failing or thinking about how I'm going to feel or my reputation. I'm thinking about my family. They rely on me. Am I doing the right thing here? Am I being responsible? I remember thinking about that. Like, I don't know if this is a responsible thing to be doing, especially when you have another kid on the way. I don't think this is the right thing to be. I'm kind of talking myself out of it. And for whatever reason, I just didn't let myself like buy into that 100%. But yeah, the main thing was just not being able to support the family and having a slow month, and everybody starts to get stressed out, me most of all. And what kind of effect will that have at home? Am I going to be less patient, more irritable? And so it was more all the personal side and just like, will I be able to handle the pressure of being the sole provider? And I'm also self-employed, which, by the way, I just described my dad. So I kind of had that to lean back on in my head as like, my dad did it. And, I talked to him anytime I felt like self-conscious or like, Dad, this seems stupid. Like, what were things like when you went out and started your own business? He's like, well, your grandparents, his parents, gave me some money so I could start the business. They basically took out a second mortgage on their house. And your mom was pregnant with you. And I was like, oh, it's all the same. Like, there is no easy way to do it. Grandma and grandpa took out a second mortgage on their house, which I never knew until he told me this. So you could start a business. So basically you were putting your parents at risk too if the business failed. You were pregnant with, at the time, I was the second. And so like, I kind of realized, all right, there's no easy way to go and do this, which was freeing. It was very freeing and liberating to be like, stop waiting. It's always going to be like this. Just do it now. And yeah, either way, it's going to work out. If I fail, yeah, there might be a few months where you're stressed out, but like, you go get another job. I'm fairly confident in myself. I know that I'm very employable. I was like, if it doesn't work out, I'll go get another job and dip into the savings for a little while, maybe to make ends meet, but it'll be fine. And then it all worked out. But yeah, all the normal things that I'm sure people weigh when they're going solo.
There's no good time. That's what I've discovered myself and hearing other people talk about it. Like, there's no real good time to do it. It's just, when does the opportunity present itself so that you're just like, all right, I guess now's the time, is what most people, the conclusion you'll come to.
It's kind of like, if you get to that point where it's like, I guess if it was going to happen, now would be the time. That was as close to as I ever got to, this is the right time or this is the perfect time. Because I don't think I would have ever gotten there. Like I said, I'm just glad that I had the courage to make that leap and make that decision. And so I think that if you get to that point, I feel like that's as good a time as any. That's as good as it's going to get, or as sure as you're going to get.
So some good content becomes a thing first, because that was really just like the core of what you had created. How did you get to some good content? Or like, how did you spin off content brands from that? Like, what's the story there?
So like, one of the first things Pete said to me when I left, he's like, you need a methodology. You can do this stuff. Like, we all know what you're good at, but you need a methodology, what you would call like a program. Like, what's your product? What is your intellectual product? So I didn't know at first. I was consulting for brands and helping them with their content. And I think this is the importance of creating, especially if you're a consultant. So like, is don't stop the creating part. I had a newsletter. I have a newsletter. And at the time it was just called Good Content. Since then it's branded Louder Than Words, which is the same in my podcast. I wanted less branded things. So the newsletter is Louder Than Words. The program in my consulting program is called Content Brands. But one of the editions of the newsletter was called Becoming a Content Brand. And it was just like most things that, that I create, I just kind of had an epiphany. It might have been like when I was walking my dog. It's like, what makes the brands that I have followed the most throughout my career, what makes them so good at content? Like, what is so different about them? And I started thinking of Wistia, and I started thinking of Buffer and a couple different brands. And I kind of like realized that I was not a customer of those brands for several years. And I was like, oh, that's kind of like a cool thing to write about. I wasn't into their product. I was into their content. So like Wistia is a product brand. Like I didn't really so much care too much about that, but their content brand, like it was almost like a separate brand. It's a separate product. I viewed it as like Wistia's content was its own brand. And I didn't need video hosting for whatever reason until, years later when I got to Databox, and then it was obvious, oh, we should use Wistia. When I was building out all the functions there and the tools we needed to use, Wistia, I didn't even consider other tools. So I wrote about this idea, this concept, and I was like, I think I started out that newsletter. I was, following Wistia's content for years before I ever became a customer. And then I said like, same for Buffer, same for blank, same for blank. There was like 5 brands I named in there. And I went on to say like, I referred these products to other people. I talked about them. I linked to them in content that I wrote. I'd mentioned them on podcasts or whatever, having never used the product until years later when it made sense. And then I didn't even have to evaluate anybody else. It was just obvious. Wistia, duh. Buffer, duh. I wrote the newsletter thinking like, I just wrote Becoming a Content Brand. That feels like a strong newsletter. Cool. And the response to it, the replies, I've never gotten more replies to an email to this day. The people mentioning it on LinkedIn, DMing me, sharing it on their own, screenshotting it. I was like, oh my God, this is something. This might be a thing. And so then it became a series. I did Becoming a Content Brand Part 2. I started talking about how to do it. And then I did Becoming a Content Brand Part 3. I did a 3-part series and they were all hits. And then I had people like Jay Kunzo, who's a good friend of mine, like message me and they were like, this content brands thing, it's got legs. You need to do something with this. I was like, yeah, like I was already thinking that, but somebody like Jay tells you that, you're like, all right, I guess I should take this more seriously. And so then I just kind of leaned into it. Okay, what is a content brand? What are they doing differently? And that's something like Jay kind of challenged me on is like, you've done a good job of like saying what a content brand is and like naming a few. Now basically be an anthropologist and study what are they doing differently that most other people aren't? What makes them a content brand? Why are they willing to invest in content in that way when others aren't? And so then I just started, like studying it more and talking more about like my experiences and like, what are the different phases of it? How do you start? And so then that became my consulting program. I felt like by the end of my first year going solo, I now had direction. I was like, okay, this is the program. I still didn't have a site yet or a site that communicated. That came later when you and I started talking. But I had like the scaffolding of what the program would be. When I really knew that it took off was when people started filling out forms to book a call with me about consulting. They would use the language back to me. I remember the first time specifically, the person said, I think we have a real opportunity to be the content brand in our space. And they just said it so matter-of-factly. And I was like, oh my God, people are now using the language back to me. And just like I say, if you build a content brand the right way, you become the obvious choice. I was becoming the obvious choice for them because no one else was talking about content in this way. I was getting all these signals from all these different places, friends saying I needed to double down, subscribers writing back and saying, this is brilliant. I shared this with my whole team. Prospects saying that they wanted to be a content brand and they felt like they had the opportunity. It was almost like I had no choice. I was like, this is it. This is the thing. And it just so happened that I was passionate about it and into it. But I don't feel like I would have been able to get there if I wasn't writing the newsletter consistently like that and being able to like aerate on it publicly. The fact that I had to create every week forced me to be more thoughtful about what I was doing and why, and what was making good content and why. And yeah, I really feel like that was the whole thing.
How did you acquire some of your first clients for content brands as a service?
10 years ago now, I've been very public with sharing stuff on Twitter, sharing stuff on LinkedIn. The Louder Than Words podcast, I started originally in 2015, and then it had like a 6-year hiatus. Basically, the entire time I was at Databox, I didn't work on that podcast. And so I have had an audience built up. Some good content I started in 2020, 2 full years before I went solo. And during that time, I had a ton of people that would reach out and be like, these things that you're talking about, do you offer services about? And I would say no. And I would refer them to people that I knew that did, or agencies. And so I feel like I had this audience already built that I had been building for the better part of a decade. And I announced that I was going solo, and I remember John Short, who's a friend of mine who runs Compound Growth Marketing, told me, just announce you're going solo and you'll get your first, you'll be good to go. And I'm like, nah, man, that's not going to work. And I made the announcement. It didn't fill up my whole roster, but that was enough to get started. And I had a bunch of people reach out, oh, you're solo now? Awesome. Booking calls. And it's not maybe what people want to hear, but it's I was laying the groundwork for this since I was at Impact 10 years ago. And just being very public and sharing and writing blog posts and having my own podcast and being very consistent on social media and sharing what I was learning. And that has compound effect over 10 years. And so when you announce that you now have a business that aligns with everything you've been talking about for 10 years, it's not easy, but demand wasn't super hard in the early days because I think there was a lot of pent up demand over the years. And now that I was finally solo, there was some brands that were like, oh, we would love to work with you. So yeah, I was able to kind of leverage that right away. And that's kind of what got me off the ground.
Did you know when you started aerating ideas on Twitter or started this podcast all those years ago that this would someday become something? Was that ever even a thought? Maybe one day I'll go out on my own and do something separate. Because 7-10 years ago, there was very few independent people at all. What was going through your head?
No, it wasn't, at least not in the form that it is now. I never was oh, I'll be able to monetize it in this way. But I remember when I first started the podcast, I remember thinking I would love to speak more on marketing, and this is going to be a vehicle to allow me to do that. Because at the time, I think I had spoken at Inbound a couple years in a row. I did a Bold Talks back when they did those. I did a couple sessions at Inbound, and I thought oh, maybe I'll to be a speaker on this stuff. That was my back in 2014, 15, when I first started the podcast. That was my initial thought was this will help me get more credibility in the space, be invited to speak at more conferences. Then I realized I actually didn't like speaking at conferences. And so I was why do I actually want to do this? Travel around the country and do 20 dates, be away from your family. So I was I actually don't want to do that. But no, I wish I was smart enough to say when I started Louder Than Words, oh, someday I'll have enough subscribers here where I'll be able to monetize this and get sponsors. You said people weren't doing that at that time. You had people like Tim Ferriss, of course, that were getting sponsors and stuff, but I was a long way away from that. So I wasn't ever thinking that oh, you'll get sponsors for this someday and this is going to build up a list and you'll be able to consult and you'll be able to work for yourself. I wasn't thinking of that far out. I just knew I had things to say, felt passionately about them, and I'm not one for keeping my mouth shut. So I just wanted to have vehicles for sharing those things. The podcast was one. Started doing that when the only people doing them was really big personalities like Tim Ferriss and big companies like HubSpot. It wasn't people like us doing podcasts really at the time. I remember the only other people I can remember doing podcasts at that time, similar to me, was Akunzo. I can't remember I think it was called Unthinkable was his podcast. And I think Dave Gearhart had Tech in Boston, which was a podcast where he just interviewed tech founders in Boston, as niche as you can get, right? And those were the only two people that I could look to as contemporaries at the time, other people doing it we were. That podcast shot to the highest I got was number 8 on iTunes business charts, which nowadays would be impossible. And so it was the listenership grew. I was getting 3,000 downloads an episode with 10 episodes in. And it was just such a different time. And I wish I stayed consistent with it. And I didn't stop for those years at Databox because who knows where it would be now. But yeah, I picked it back up. And to your initial question, I didn't necessarily think that it would lead to what I'm doing now back then. I think it's hard to see that. But what that's taught me is just keep investing in your platform, sharing on LinkedIn, your newsletter. Because another 10 years from now, you might have me on a podcast again and be did you think that doing all that back in 2024 was going to lead to this? So you just never know. And so now I'm just all right, I have to keep creating, and you just don't know what doors that'll open up.
My friend Chris Marr said this when I chatted with him, and it lives rent free and it comes up so often, but I think it summarizes this perfectly. Because he started an Instagram, and it was just basically him giving thoughts on coaching, and it became a book. He wrote a book about it. He started his own consulting company or coaching company based on the methodology, all the stuff. He's doing so much stuff with this. And I was what was the plan back then? And he was go to the end of the week. That was it. And I think that's we're all pre-wired from like marketing birth to be like, you need to see it all the way through before you ever start. And that's why most good ideas never make it. You can't quite see it yet, but you're like, I know that this is like important work. I know this should be done, but I'm not exactly sure. Like you didn't know that 10 years later, the landscape of like solopreneurship would be a huge thing, and that you could use this as leverage in that way. But you just did it because you knew, you're like, this is important. This should be done. And I don't know any other reason why.
Back then, I remember Impact getting checks in the mail from clients for invoices. Now I send Stripe links. You know what I mean? So it's like so many things changed to enable this. And how could you have back then? How could I have been like, well, in 10 years, I'm going to be able to easily run my own solo business where people can, like, I could send links and payments will be so much easier. Click of a button. How could you have seen that? Who the hell knows? But just, I always tell people, don't quit before it gets good. And I think that has double meaning to it. One, before people really catch on and you hit your stride. But then also, like, you don't know where the tech is going to go. And all of a sudden, what you're doing is just amplified by so much more, or the technology is going to make what you've been doing, it's going to enable you to do this other thing. And so, like, don't quit before it gets good. And I think that goes right along with what you were saying. We want it to be good so that we keep going. And it's like, it doesn't work that way. You almost have to create for yourself in the early days, and which goes against everybody being like, create for your customers, answer the questions. I don't know, because you might not get the dopamine required to continue going because you might not get many people listening. So I feel like you really have to make it interesting for yourself and create for yourself, and just don't quit before it gets good.
I feel like this is the most counterintuitive advice that I've heard someone give on this idea, but I think it sums it up perfectly, because a lot of people will say, well, that's John Bonini saying that. He's got 40,000 followers on LinkedIn. Of course, he can just post and say, I'm open for business, and get some posts and get some people to sign up, or like get some calls booked. But like, they didn't see, or what people will forget about, is like all the years of hacking it together and trying to figure it out that people go through. Like, you had built for years. Like, I'd tried maybe for around 2-ish years before I went out on my own and tried to monetize that, right? Or tried to just like acquire clients, where some people will start the day that they also start their business. And it's just like a way steeper hill to climb than is to just lay it out. Yeah, it can be done, but it's like to lay it out and just start building and becoming known over years just builds up the social capital that you need. So when you're just like, hey, like, I'm doing this thing now, it's just, there's a lot less friction there, or there's a lot less risk for people to give you their money.
The only reason I have those followers or the newsletter subscriber is because of years of not monetizing and just sharing openly and honestly, and podcasting before other people were, and not worrying about, well, everyone else is doing it, so who cares? Like, I have my own things to say. And so investing early and often in your own platform, like if you're listening to this today and be like, well, if I start today, imagine 5 years from now, like how much easier will that make things for you? If you just started now, didn't quit before it got good, and just kept going. Like, imagine how easier things will be in 5-6 years. And then people will be going about you, will be going, it's easy for him to say, it's only because he has this and this. Well, it's like, yeah, this guy wasn't paying attention to the 5 years where I was like, should I keep doing this? Feels like nobody's listening, or feels like nobody's reading. Or like, I've done 3 different iterations of this thing. Like, do people think I'm like dumb and can't figure this out? So yeah, that's the stuff people, I think, just they miss or discount. And that is everything. The journey's part of it.
Yeah, there's a picture that you've shared of you sitting on the floor with your laptop, like on a shoebox or something, and you're interviewing Seth Godin.
When I first started Louder Than Words, I had like several guests on one hand that I wanted on. I wanted Seth Godin. I wanted Austin Kleon, who might be a little bit more niche, but he writes Steal Like an Artist. And he was an author. Like, he writes these really like almost like graphic novels of advice for if you create anything, painter, writer, whatever, Ryan Holiday, Jason Fried from Basecamp. So I got all these people on, all of them. And I had to reach out to Seth Godin. He had just written a book called It's Your Turn. It was all about basically like capitalizing when it's your time and not asking for forgiveness and just like making room for yourself. And so I emailed him and was like, it's my turn, and I'm asking like you to be on. So I like used his own title of his book against him. He came on the podcast, and yeah, that picture you're talking about, I had like a little bench like that. I was sitting on the floor. I had this bench like scooted up to me, almost like a snack table. I had my microphone, my Sony microphone, and my laptop, my MacBook on this little table. And I had some pillows next to me. So Seth Godin wouldn't think I sounded like a amateur. And so the echo wasn't too bad because we weren't doing video back then. I was using Skype. And so it was just audio. So he wouldn't been able to see how like lo-fi everything looked. And yeah, I looked like a scrub. I was wearing like Adidas, sweatpants and a t-shirt, but I interviewed Seth Godin and that thing went so far and wide and everyone thought I was this big B2B podcaster because I was getting all these big guests. I'm like, if they could only see my setup right now there's so much more pressure to have everything all put together. But at the time, yeah, I shared that really just to show people that like, you don't need to have it all together and figured out to get started. Just get started and start creating that momentum for yourself and then keep it going. That's one of my favorite photos. I had to like text my wife. I was like, you took a photo of me. We weren't even engaged at the time. That was my now wife's house that she was living in at the time. And that was her master bedroom floor. And she came in. I didn't ask her to take that. She just came in. She's like, this looks silly. I'm going to take a photo. Because I think her dog was like right next to me too. And I had to like text her like whenever I shared that for the first time a year or two ago, I was like, can you find that photo? Because I can't find it in any of my iCloud or anything. And she went back like 2 minutes, texted it to me. And I was like, this is an amazing photo that I always need to keep and remember for so many different reasons. But yeah, now I think I shared it in a newsletter in the last year and was like, this is me interviewing Seth Godin. I had nothing put together. It's a lesson for me. And I was hoping that maybe it would resonate with somebody else, that you don't have to have the perfect gear and everything doesn't have to be perfect to get started.
I love the photo because it is the perfect like visual representation of that idea. It's like you don't have to have it all figured out.
Yeah.
It also is a healthy reminder that back then it was just like an audio. It was a Skype call, which I looked at that picture and I was like, oh, he's video chatting with somebody. Like I didn't even consider the fact that it was an audio only call with Seth Godin.
I didn't do any. There was none of those were video calls. Yeah. Ryan Holiday came on.
How'd you get them? How'd you get like Ryan and Jason and all those other?
Well, Ryan, I reached out to a mutual friend who I'll name because it's your podcast. And we'll be out like Noah Kagan, who most people listening probably know. Him and I had talked a little bit back then about potentially a job. He essentially was looking to potentially recruit me at, what was this company called? Sumo? AppSumo or whatever. It didn't work out, but we were friends and reached out to him because he was based in Austin. So I reached out to Noah first. I was like, hey man, like just started this podcast. Would love to have him on. And he wrote back and was like, yeah, I don't know. Those guys get hit up a lot for podcasts. So maybe type up something for me. And then at that point I stopped reading. I was like, never mind, dude. And so I just cold outreach to Ryan Holiday myself and was like, hey, I started this podcast. Will you come on? And he said, yes. And I think it was a product of that there wasn't many of these happening at the time. It was kind of new and fresh, like, oh, podcast. Okay, cool. He must be a big deal. I was not. So like it was all cold outreach. Every time somebody would come on the podcast, I would end it with like, can you intro me to one person who you think would be a great guest? But it wasn't Seth Godin, Ryan. It was none of those. And so I just cold outreach to Ryan, cold outreach to Jason Fried, cold outreach to Seth Godin, cold outreach to Austin Kleon. All the biggest names on there were cold outreach and they all said yes. Now, I didn't get any no's except for Noah Kagan saying no to introducing me to somebody, but no hard feelings. I got him on anyway. So if Noah ever listens to this, like no hard feelings, all love. So honestly, it was just cold outreach, which maybe to be fair was probably easier back then. Like if I sent cold outreach now to Ryan Holiday, I probably wouldn't even get a response. So again, it was a product of the time where it was just easier. There wasn't as many of these podcasts. Those guys are probably getting, and now Ryan Holiday, this was like 5 New York Times bestsellers ago. So now he's on like, he might've been on Joe Rogan or like he's been on huge podcasts where I'm like, he was also on Louder Than Words. I wonder if he puts that in his bio. Ryan Holiday, guest on podcasts like Louder Than Words. No, just kidding. Probably not. But yeah, it was just cold outreach, man. Just took my chances and it just worked out.
I think about that. And then I think about how your grandparents had to take out a second mortgage on their house for your dad to start his business. And it's like the things that you need to do to start a business now is basically nothing. You need to have an internet connection and a laptop.
Yeah. Get an email address. The stuff required to get started now is so much less that you could literally have a couple $100s in overhead with a few tools really to get started. And that's it.
It's crazy how much money you don't need. Like a card website is like $10 for a year. You can get them for free if you want the branding. Like an email is like $7 a month.
You could be on a free Calendly for a while. You don't need to pay for it.
Free HubSpot got me really far.
You become so economical. You're like, nah, I don't need to pay a plan. I could live with one calendar link for now. I'll just keep shutting this one off when I need the other one. And you become so economical, which is funny because like when I was leading marketing in-house, I was probably like, no, we need this tool. We need the pay tool. And not to bring up Pete again, but he would always be like, whatever we don't have to pay for. How far could we get with the free plan? And I remember being like, God damn, man, like, some of this stuff we have to pay for, and then you go solo, and you're like, nah, I don't need to pay for any of this. Sometimes, like, I've upgraded this stuff, and I'm like, oh, why did I do that? Yeah,
like, why did I do that?
Yeah, it becomes something, or like, why do I need this tool? Like, my stack is pretty minimal, or it's pretty bare bones, and for me to add a new tool that I'm gonna have to learn, it really has to add value. Otherwise, I just try to keep things as simple as possible.
Yeah, I saw a post today that was like, here's my tech stack as a business of one. And it was like $600 a month in tools. And I was like, what the heck is all this stuff?
I think some people think it's a flex. It's like, look at all the tools I'm using. Look how complex it's like, no, man, show me the guy who's like, here's my tech stack. And it's like 4 tools and it's like $320 a month. Okay, now imagine if that guy's bringing in 10, 15, 20K. Like it's just, yeah, it's crazy.
One of the things like I did early on, I was like, I bought like a Zoom account. I was like, no, my Google account comes with Google Meet. Like I hate Google Meet, but like you don't need Zoom to make money. Like you can make money.
I've used Google Meet now since I've gone solo, and I actually prefer it.
The screen sharing is what got me, but they just recently updated everything, so the screen sharing is not as terrible as it was. So I might end up going back. But I was like, you definitely don't need Zoom. But I was like, for $16, it's just I like the experience. But I was like, you're just getting rid of money for no reason.
Or you think it like makes you official or makes you look more professional. I've had people jump on my Google Meet and they'll be like, oh, this is actually easier. Or they'll be like, let's just use your Google Meet from now on. And I'm like, I'm not even paying for this. So like this is,
I mean, you are, it's in your email. It's just,
yeah. I mean, it's all part of it, but yeah, as simple as I can make things, I would prefer not to pay for things unless it really adds value. Podcast hosting, email client. I do pay for Calendly now just because with the podcast, with prospect one-on-one calls, friend calls, like those are all different calendars to me. So I ended up paying for that, but like the lowest plan, Riverside to record podcasts, it's not much. And I'm on like the base, like $19.99 plan for all those.
Yeah. The best deal I got was HubSpot starter is like $15 a month. And you get the calendar, you get the dashboard, the CRM. I was like, yeah, this is the way. I was stoked on that.
Yeah, that's the way to go.
All right, dude. So looking back in this like long year and a half, what's something you would have done differently?
Probably not one thing. There's probably a lot of things. I'm not going to be one of those people that lies to you and be like, I don't regret anything. There's always things that you would do differently. Probably this is more like tactical, but like a lot of my engagements would time box them as 3 months. You and I have talked a lot about this, and you'd be like, why do you time box it at 3 months? It's like, well, that's the program, and we keep working together month to month after that, but that's the initial program. And I remember just adding a month to that. Like, it's 4 months now, and nobody batted an eye, and I realized I've been costing myself so much money for the past year by saying 3 months instead of 4. And so, like, it's more like small things like that, operational things that I think you really have to just do this to start to learn. And why am I doing certain things this way? Or like packaging and learning all about that. I just think it's hard to approach it any other way than like I'm learning on the fly with that stuff. So I would say like small things like that, like how I'm packaging the service, having like a really productized service like up front, which I didn't have. But I also think like I needed to go through those first client engagements and create and write the newsletter and hear feedback from people. I needed to go through that to really understand what would be an effective service. So I don't know, it's all part of the learning experience. There's a bunch of stuff I'm sure I'm doing now that a year from now, I'm gonna be like, why was I doing it that way? But it's a lot of probably smaller things like that. Nothing really massive comes to mind where it's like, I wish I did that differently. It's a lot of smaller things, packaging decisions, the service, like structuring it a certain way, or like how I was selling myself early on versus now. And then all that stuff is just going to change even now, from now until next year. And yeah, I think I put a lot of pressure on myself early on to have it all together and have everything feel done. And now that pressure is just gone because I know that this is all just like a living, breathing thing and it's going to evolve over the next year. And probably like not to put as much pressure on myself in the early days. I think like anything else, I don't know if you felt this way, but when I first went solo, I felt a lot of weight. Like I would have these moments where like almost like I would become conscious of what I did, like all in the moment where you just kind of sitting there enjoying yourself and be like, holy shit, I work for myself. Like all of this is on me. If all my clients go away next month, I have no money. Like on a bike ride with your kid, like I would just have these moments and they don't happen anymore. And I think it's just because you just get used to it and you get used to being like, all right, it's been 6 months, things are still good. Okay, it's been a year, things are still good. All right, it's been a year and a half. And so you kind of just have to like go through those first few months of panic and just kind of like withstand it to realize like, it's going to be all right. It's going to be fine. And so I don't have those scary moments anymore because I think you just get used to that. Weight's kind of like exercise, I guess. And so it's easy to tell yourself if I could go back, don't stress as much about it, worry about the things you could control, but I think it's also part of it. It's just a part of it. Like everybody I've talked to, like we have, I'm sharing about this like clandestine Slack group that we have, but we have a Slack group for solopreneurs that I started with Andrew Kaplan. But like in talking with people on there and having conversations, like everybody talks about that first, 6 months, year. We all go through the same thing. I just feel like you have to. So nothing major, a lot of small things around packaging and how I structure my service and things like that are going to change anyways. So
we all feel this like weird sense to have it all figured out straight from the rip. And then once you realize like, oh, every time I say this to someone and they don't get it, I just learned something. And now I just learned how to say it. And I just got to fix it and say it a little bit more clearly. Or like when you sell it and you're like, oh, like they said yes to me, like, let me add an extra month or let me change the way that I price this. It's all just a test. Every single time you price is a test. Every single time you pitch is a test. Like it's never going to be done. You'll get it to really good.
Right. Yeah, exactly. But then really good, the bar will raise in a year. And it'll keep getting better and better. And I think the hope is you look back in 5 years and be like, man, I didn't have anything figured out. I kind of feel that way when I listen to old podcasts of myself from years ago. I'm like, man, you sucked. If you look back 5 years and you're like, man, I was great back then you have not improved and you have not raised the bar. So yeah, I think it's kind of to be expected.
This will be episode 30 of this show. And I'm like,
wow, you still suck. I know. See, no, I'm kidding.
I'm like, damn, I have like episode 1, I felt bad for Andrew. I was like, damn, he put on a brave face. But to watch that progression, that's just 30 episodes. I can't imagine over the course of like a decade.
I think you've done great. And the clips I see from the stories that you get out of people, and when I see you share the clips, I'm like, you get it, right? Like you understand like where to go with the conversations and like you're getting more interesting stories and insights out of people than most other podcasts. But yeah, like anything else, you look back in a year and be like, man, that sucked. That's what I hope for when I look back on my old stuff. Otherwise, I'm like, okay, I haven't evolved as much as I think I have or something. So I hope I look back to my podcast that I'm recording now and be like, man, you blew that question. Or I think it becomes like smaller things over time. It's not like I sucked altogether. It's like, you blew so many opportunities to ask these follow-ups, or you could have went deeper on this thing. They were like almost there and then you moved on to the next question. And it's like small things like that I'll notice. And like, that's what I really try to focus on now.
It's hard when you don't edit the show. I edited the first 10 episodes myself before I outsourced the production. And doing that was the forcing function to be like, oh, like you sound like an idiot. Like you're really bad at explaining questions, or you ask too many loaded questions, or you don't follow up. Like you miss so many great opportunities. Like that was a really, really the most effective way. Like I don't think there's a way to circumvent that process.
Probably not.
To get better without it.
That's a good point. I produced mine for years until the last year. I was always doing it myself. So I think you do learn a lot about yourself, and you're forced to listen to yourself, which is always cringe, but yeah, you learn a ton.
Yeah. Then you kind of just build up that tolerance to hearing your own voice. You're like, okay, I guess it's like, I can survive it.
Yeah.
All right, dude, let's end here, man. What do you want to build that you haven't built yet?
I don't know. It's probably not related to tech and what we're doing now. I don't know exactly what that is yet. Like I have other interests and sometimes I'll often think about that. For example, I'm coaching my 8-year-old son's basketball team right now, and basketball was life for me as a kid, and he's similar. But I don't think there's like a resource for a lot of these kids in town to like learn the fundamentals. They just get thrown into these youth leagues and the coaches are all volunteers and they just get thrown into games. But I see all these other like programs that are built by that are in like bigger cities that haven't made it into the rural America yet. Sometimes I'll think about stuff like that. But like what I'm doing now, like I love what I'm doing now and that'll continue to evolve. But yeah, I don't know. Things I haven't built yet. Sometimes I think about like away from the computer and like what would be some cool things there that would be exciting. And so, yeah, I don't know. I don't know if it would be in this realm or if I'll ever get to build it. But yeah, I don't know. Someday.
You took an interesting direction with that question, which was like outside of like building beyond content branch. Like I asked like if I could be a full-time basketball coach for your kids.
Not even a basketball coach, just like a youth program that, just build I don't know. But yeah, that's often what I think about. Like, of course, I have things that I want to build in content brands. Like one should be coming very shortly, which is more like a group. I want to create something just for people who have a podcast and want it to kind of be the linchpin of their whole content strategy. They don't feel like they're getting enough out of it. They kind of record the episodes, share the links. It's not growing very fast. And they have all this stuff buried in the podcast. They don't even realize it. And they might not be asking the best questions, which isn't going to yield them the best content. And so I want to put together this like kind of group coaching program where I work with 5 people at a time. We meet every week. And the whole thing is like we improve upon their podcast. We build out all the supporting stuff that it helps. That'll be the next thing. So it's a little more one-to-many instead of just the one-to-one consulting that I'm doing now. So like short term, that's what I want to and am building. But like long term, like life stuff, yeah, I don't know. Sometimes I think about outside of the computer, what that could look like.
Yeah. The group coaching program, I think is the next iteration for a lot of us. Like if you think about the way most people build, like people are either building top down or bottom up, and top down is the easiest way to live your life because it's services at the top. And then you kind of go in a group and then more asynchronous or self-paced stuff. So we're on the same wave there. And then, I mean, the whole point of doing this work, no matter what shape it takes, is to do something so you don't have to work.
Might even not have to work, but maybe do some other things.
Or just work a little less. Like,
yeah.
I think we all do this work because we enjoy it. But yeah, I mean, we were talking about this earlier. You have 5 kids. Like, there's a lot of activities. There's probably something going on every single day.
Oh, yeah. There's
so much that you can be involved in that you could spend your whole life just being involved with all the youth programs that they got going on.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. There's always something, man. Never a dull evening. Dance, basketball, gymnastics, something.
Putting a lot of miles on the Sienna.
Oh, yeah. You got it.
Dude, this has been fun, man. Thank you for coming on and sharing your story. I know more people feel seen because of it, my friend.
Awesome, man. Good to hear, man. Thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Hell yeah, dude. Hey, Nick again, and thanks for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, you can sign up for the 1000 Routes newsletter, where I process the insights and stories you hear on this show into frameworks and lessons to help you build a new and different future for your own business. You can sign up at 1000routes.com or check the link in the show notes. There's really only one thing I really, really need to know.
Yeah. And
that is, what would be your last meal on earth?
Yeah, so my answer is not going to be maybe as bougie as, I don't know what your other guests say, but it's very specific. I'm Italian, so I grew up Sunday sauce, cavatellis with tomato sauce, meatballs, some eggplant on side, some grated Parmesan. I could eat that every day of my life. And then if there was like a secondary, pizza, because, I still am a child, I guess, and pizza's pizza. And I'm in Connecticut, so we have New Haven style pizza. So I'd probably call it Pepe's and be like, listen, this is my last pie before I head to, Europa or Mars, wherever I'm going. I need the large moots and, maybe with some chicken on half or something like that. So a lot of tomato sauce. Yeah, that would be involved in my last meal on earth.
You know how I know you're like real Italian? Because you said cavadillo, not cavatelli.
Yeah. You can't pronounce the ricotta, cavatelli. If you really want to get nuts, you got to roll the R. Ergot,